Okay, guys, here's the first of a series of lectures that we're going to have over American life in the Roaring Twenties. This chapter is going to primarily focus on exactly what it says, American life. So we're not going to get a lot into the stock market, although a lot of the things we're going to talk about in terms of the way Americans begin to live their life, in terms of margin buying, in terms of credit, things of that nature, are all going to be sort of side effects of the stock market, which we talked about before you guys went on break. So a couple things just to note. First of all, I'll be posting probably one of these a night here as we start this first week of break. So those of you that are maybe sitting at home waiting to go on break that second week, you'll be able to see one of these every night throughout the first week. Those of you that are on break this first week, especially those of you that are in Italy, when you return, you'll be able to watch all of these in one fell swoop. And I'm guessing that a number of you are probably going to wait until that last Saturday and Sunday before we return to watch these anyway. In addition, as a reminder, and I'd put this out there at the end of the day on Thursday in both class periods, any handwritten notes that you take over this material will be able to be used on the quiz that you'll take on Monday when we return. And again, that is handwritten notes. If you type anything out, I will not allow you to have your computer out while you are taking your quiz, but anything you write down by hand is fair game. Additionally, because I'm at home and not at school, I do not have the ability to underline like I normally do when we're there in class. So it's going to be really important not only to pay attention to what is on the slides as we go, but also listen, because there are going to be certain things that I emphasize or certain things that I need to add to what is written. I think that's all in the way of reminders before we get started. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into American life in the Roaring Twenties. So there's a number of different social changes after World War I that are going to take place, but the biggest ones are those two terms there, Americanism and nativism. And we're going to sort of get into that here at the beginning. Warren G. Harding is elected president in 1920. He is essentially the political opposite of Wilson. So you see the Republicans taking control of the White House again. Now it is worth mentioning that Harding is not a return to form of Roosevelt and Taft, necessarily Republicans Roosevelt and Taft, who we saw at the beginning of the 1900s. But he is politically the opposite of Woodrow Wilson. He has this idea and this campaign slogan of return to normalcy. Again, we are sort of coming out of that World War I era. Short-lived as our combat experience was in World War I. Obviously, as we saw in the last chapter, there's a lot of things that are going on domestically that are out of the norm. They're not what we think of as normal American life during this time period. And so that's what Harding runs on, is sort of this return to what he considers normalcy. His policies are very beneficial for big business, which sort of going hand in hand with that are very investment friendly policies, I guess you could say. He's going to encourage people to invest, both on the big business side, but also his policies are going to be very beneficial for the stock market as well. And you could see that if you sort of were following along, with the stock market game that we played before you guys left. He is also very anti-League of Nations, and he's also isolationist. And that isolationism is going to be what plays into this idea of Americanism, this idea of nativism, that, America is sort of this great nation, and that we really need to, the way that we got to be that great nation was we focused on ourselves, we kept to ourselves, and that's what we sort of need to get back to. And so that's where you get that idea of those two terms. Now, there are some other things that he does as well, just sort of in general. And we'll return to Harding again later, and we're going to find that he was very trusting, almost to a fault. He hires some rather shady characters, but some of the other things that he does, he is very bad for the organized labor movement, which would make sense as he is sort of a big business type. Striking is one of those things that becomes sort of taboo in the 1920s, not something that a lot of labor groups are going to go to, because it is not met very favorably in political circles. All those different antitrust acts that were passed in the early 1900s are not very strongly enforced. They are not repealed, but they're also just sort of allowed to be broken. Again, we've seen this term pop up a couple of times since the revolution or the precursor to the revolution, but it's almost that salutary neglect, becomes one of those things that the government's not willing to enforce. And so businesses and the like are willing to ignore. And really, by and large, workers, the average American worker, sees little of the money produced by this economic boom. They see enough of it, but when you look at it by percentage, they see relatively little of it, because labor is relatively weak during this time period. Now, that being said, they see enough of it to where the average American worker, when we get to the Great Depression, is going to be the one who bears the brunt of it. But by percentage, they actually see very, very little, which should give you some indication of the massive amounts of wealth that are being accrued in the 1920s. Looking at your map, and we see one of these with every presidential election. How does a guy like Harding become president? One, he again is strongly against. I shouldn't say he's strongly against. He is anti-League of Nations, but he's not vehemently against it. Whereas like his opponent, James Cox, is a strong supporter of the League of Nations. It really makes Harding out to be a little bit more radical than what he was. But his vagueness is really what kind of allows him to become elected. And again, he's a really sort of an interesting guy in that regard. Also, women voting for the first time in federal elections, are a big help to Harding. Wilson is the one who sort of pushes for, the 19th Amendment in 1919, and eventually gets the 19th Amendment passed in 1919, which helped him in those midterm elections in 1918. But women actually did not get a chance to vote for Wilson. And by the time women do get a chance to vote nationally, it actually ends up hurting Wilson's Democratic Party by getting the Republican Harding into office. And so that's, and you see the map. He dominates everywhere but the Deep South. And that's sort of how he gets elected. It's not really a close election at all. Again, we see Debs once again running for president. And you can see sort of the political cartoons right there, or the political cartoon right there. Debs runs for president. I believe this is the last time that he will run for president, and I believe it's his third attempt at becoming the the head of the executive. Now, the return of soldiers, and we're going to see this as a theme also, as we move into the 20th century with regard to soldiers returning from overseas. Returning soldiers causes a lot of economic and social strain. There's a lot of strikes from soldiers who are looking for their jobs back. There are also a lot of strikes from, they shouldn't be called strikes, but there are protests of individuals who have their jobs taken away and given back to soldiers who are returning from the war. So Seattle, for example, Boston with the police force, etc. Immigration also is going to add to workers' frustrations. Again, this is not an issue that we experience today, and you're gonna notice that a lot of the social issues that we're going to start talking about, starting in the 19 teens. You could see a little bit of this in the last chapter, but now in the 1920s, and as we move forward, a lot of these issues, return of soldiers causing strain. This is something that happens today. And that's what you're going to notice. A lot of these issues are going to continue to sort of recycle themselves, only with whatever the modern spin is. And in the case of the 1920s, it's immigration. Now immigration, as we talked about earlier, when we talked about the hesitation on our part of getting involved in World War I, immigration is something that in the 19-teens, the 1920s, is still a very relevant part of what's going on in America. You have a lot of first, second generation Americans, and that makes things difficult because, those first and second generation immigrants, they are not viewed, by, your more established Americans. They're not viewed as loyal, or they're at least seen as possibly being disloyal. That doesn't mean that they are. That's just the way that they are viewed. And so that also adds to workers' frustrations, because while they're seen as disloyal, part of the reason that they're seen as disloyal is that they're willing to work for less money than, your red-blooded Americans who are already established. And so that becomes, that sort of adds to workers' frustrations as well. Now that being said, workers are also seeing their rights curtailed, as we saw earlier. You have a president in office that's not really favorable towards the working class, in terms of, their ability to unionize and strike and things of that nature. So there's a lot of social strain. There's a lot of sort of smaller problems brewing under the surface that are going to get ignored because, quite frankly, everybody's making a lot of money in the 1920s. Even the workers, while they're not seeing as much as they could be, workers are still seeing pay bumps. And that's enough to sort of allow them to sort of take one eye off of all these sort of undercurrents of strain that are going on. The other big, and I shouldn't say the other big, this is really the big domestic scare, in the 1920s is that of communism. I mentioned this earlier. Communism was used by the Germans as a weapon in World War I of sorts, where they tried to, and they did successfully spread communism to the Soviet Union. And that causes a lot of fear and trepidation in Europe, and it also causes a lot of fear and trepidation in the United States upon the war's end. And what especially makes us nervous is all the happenings in Russia. So there's a gentleman by the name of Mitchell Palmer, who is the Attorney General, and he is going to execute a series of mass arrests that are going to become known as the Palmer Raids, where basically he's looking for anybody who could potentially be considered communist or might have ties to communism, and he's going to arrest them. He's going to then jail them or deport them because they are seen as dangerous in the eyes of, again, the sort of isolationist, democratic, red-blooded American. And this is what is known as the Red Scare. And it's this sort of post-war fear of communism, or really any idea that is considered, quote, un-American, unquote. Now we're going to stop here, as my time is almost done. So when we come back, we're going to start with sort of what is communism? Why is it so feared, here in the United States? And then we're going to sort of continue to carry on from there. So this is the end of part 1. Part 2 will probably be posted sometime Monday night.